Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here for this second of 6 Christmas lectures on the general subject of planets. In the last lecture, we examined a strange and exotic planet, the Earth, and only after some effort did we discover that it was inhabited, that it had some living creatures on it. Now, the life on Earth is something we're concerned about, that since we're a part of it, we think it very important. And yet that life covers an extraordinarily thin layer of the planet. It is, as Sir James Jeans once said, a kind of rust on the planetary surface. And one question which always arises, every human culture has wondered about it, is how did life come to be? Where did the rust come from? And if we consider any organism, even very simple ones, it's astonishing what they're able to do. Take some fairly humble organism, let's say a rabbit. Think of what rabbits can do. One thing they can do is hop. Now, you may not be very impressed with a rabbit's hop, but rabbits hop better than the best hopping machines which people have made so far. Rabbits do it better than we know how to make machines do it. Or consider the munching of lettuce. Rabbits eat lettuce, but not only do they eat it, they convert it into rabbit. Today's rabbit's brains are yesterday's lettuce. Now, we can't do that. We can't take some lettuce and do something to it, and the end product, we have a rabbit brain. But the rabbit is able to do that perfectly well. Probably the rabbit brain never thinks about where the rabbit brain came from. Many human brains never think about where human brains come from. Or think of the remarkable ability of rabbits to make more rabbits. Probably they don't know in great detail how that comes about, although the essentials I'm sure they've mastered. That's a very complex business to make a rabbit from scratch and some lettuce. Animals and plants are able to do remarkable things. They've been on the Earth for a long time, although human beings have not. We are only a few million years on the planet, and life has been here for some thousands of millions of years. And what a remarkable diversity of life there is. For example, let's take a look at some kinds of life on the Earth and just remind ourselves about how remarkable it is. This is an orchid that goes to very great lengths to induce insects and in some cases bats to pollinate it, to encourage it to make more orchids. Here is a great rainforest. The largest trees on the Earth go to hundreds of feet high. Think of the enormous lushness, diversity, and complexity of the organisms that inhabit this forest. Here is a mosquito able to fly. What a remarkable thing to have things on your back which you flap and away you go. Humans have not figured out how to do that, but we're a lot heavier than the insects. Or here's another organism that's managed to learn how to fly, the only flying mammal, the bat. And here is a cousin of ours, a monkey that eats leaves, and perhaps is not so far distant from us as some of us would like to think. And here's a lovely organism, the zebra, with a beautiful kind of pattern on its coat. Now, these are all big animals that we're used to. But most of the animals and plants on the earth are little animals, things so small that we can't see them with the naked eye. And I'd like to spend just a moment on those fellows. So here, for example, are some bacteria, very small, much smaller than the human eye can see unaided, in the process of mating, which they do occasionally, not all the time, to encourage genetic diversity. Here is an aphid, which we're looking straight at, and certainly an interesting beast that ants farm. They use them as domestic animals. Here is one kind of pollen. Here is the surface of a leaf. I think it's a geranium, but I'm not sure. These lovely three-dimensional pictures are taken with a machine called a scanning electron microscope. And here is the surface of another kind of leaf. Look at the beauty, the regularity, the geometry which exists in the microscopic world, all produced by biological systems. And here are some microbes which live in snow. And it's quite interesting that there are organisms which are able to live in extremely exotic environments. Over here, we have a bee's knee, close up. Bees have knees, 6 of them. Spiders have 8 knees. Humans have only 2. And you can see that the attention to detail which nature has made at the level of the bee's knee is pretty substantial. And here is an astonishing creature called a tardigrade, which when things are dry, curls up into and becomes a kind of speck of dust and can last that way for very long periods of time, probably thousands of years at least. And then when things get wet, you moisten a tardigrade, and he uncoils and starts walking away, looking a little bit like a bear with 8 or 10 legs, however many he happens to have. Let's spend a moment on this lovely film. Here we see a boiling hot spring in Yellowstone National Park. And you can see what the temperatures are, almost 90 degrees. Organisms live there just fine. Here are people in the Antarctic digging a core through the ice. And it turns out in those extremely low temperatures, there are organisms that survive simply fine. Here is a fish that swims in almost freezing water. It has, lovely fish, it has a antifreeze, like we use in automobiles, so that it doesn't freeze over when the temperature drops below the normal freezing point of water. That's a remarkable adaptation, and antifreezes came into existence before automobiles. Here is a kind of organism which happens to love sulfuric acid. It doesn't like water at all. There are organisms which can live in hot sulfuric acid but gasp and die when you put them in ordinary water. Here is one of the most remarkable organisms ever to come into existence on the Earth, the cellular slime mold. You can see individual cells that have come together to make a kind of cellular collective, which is big enough to see, big enough to walk, and is far more exotic than the strangest beasts ever imagined by the writers of science fiction. In my view, life on Earth has far outstripped what our science fiction writers have been able to imagine. Now, this is just a small variety of organisms that I've shown you. Let me show a live organism just for variety. This little fellow, oh good, he stood up for the television camera, is a kangaroo rat, so-called in part because he stands on his hind legs. Remarkable, among other things, because the kangaroo rat, at least some people think this is the case, doesn't drink. Gets all its water from metabolic water, that is, from eating food and breaking down the food and extracting water from the solids of the food. Obviously a good thing to do if you live in a desert environment. There are many more strange organisms on the Earth. There are organisms which have very strange sensory abilities. There are insects which see in the ultraviolet. Many flowering plants have the flower pattern in the ultraviolet to attract the insects. All sorts of garish signs, arrows pointing to the pollen, and signs in bee language saying, "Free eats, come this way," which we can't see because we only see visible light. But the insects that know about ultraviolet light see those signs fine and pollinate the plants. Bees that recognize the polarization of sunlight. Pigeons that can detect magnetic fields of 10 to the minus fifth Gauss, 100,000th of a Gauss. Such a tiny magnetic field that scientific instruments to measure such fields in space have only been developed in the last decade. There are pit vipers that can observe the world in the infrared and strike the prey when it's dark. There is a French grasshopper which has on its back a kind of thing that looks like a radio antenna. It sends audio messages to female French grasshoppers, which they enjoy receiving. There is an African fish called Gymnarchus niloticus, which sets up an electric field in the water around it and discerns predators and prey by sensing a change in the electric field which it has set up. A sense completely different from any that we have, us humans. Now, that's just a slight hint of the variety, remarkable abilities of organisms on the Earth. Where did they come from? How long have they been around? Now, if I could find some fossils, I would be extremely happy. Thank you, Bill, because the fossils give us some reminder that there has been life around for a while. This is a single vertebra from the fossil of a single vertebra from the spinal column of an enormous ugly dinosaur called Iguanodon, which trudged around maybe even the British Isles a few 100 million years ago. And if we had one in this room, he would just fit. Iguanodons and other dinosaurs do not exist anymore. All sorts of kinds of life have disappeared. Many more varieties of life have become extinct than exist today on the Earth. Here is a fossil of a crinoid, which lived in the ancient ocean bottoms and waved around there. There are no crinoids on the Earth today. And here is a lovely, beautiful jewel of an organism called a trilobite. Trilobites lived as long ago as the Cambrian period, about 500 to 600 million years ago. They, some people think, hunted in herds on the ocean bottoms, had beautiful compound eyes, some of them much larger than this, and there are no more trilobites on the Earth today either. Now, 600 million years is not very much in the lifetime of the Earth, which is almost 4.5 thousand million years old. I hope you will forgive me if I use American billions henceforth. An American billion is 1,000 million. Let us look at fossils that are microscopic. If you take a rock and slice it thin, and are lucky, you might find something like this sphere with inclusions in it. There is a detailed interior architecture which perhaps you can make out. This is what you find from a rock 45 million years old. Here, a rock 900 million years old. Here, one 1,100 million years old. Here, 1,800 or 1.8 billion years old. And here, 3.1 billion years old. And in fact, things like this have now been found in rocks about 3.5 billion years old. These are bacteria and blue-green algae. They are the simplest organisms on the Earth, but they are not all that simple. They have a remarkable interior architecture. They are very clever at turning one chemical into another chemical, at making exact copies of themselves. Therefore, these bacteria and algae could not be the earliest organisms. They needed a long period of time before then for them to evolve. The Earth is only about 4.5 billion years old, and in its earliest history was probably unsuited for life. For example, we believe the surface was molten, and that makes it uncomfortable for living organisms if the rocks are melted all over the planet. So life could not have come into being as early as 4.5 billion, and could not have come into being as late as 3.5 billion. There seems to be only a small period of time in which the origin of life happened, at most a few 100 million years. 6 days was once a popular hypothesis. It is not excluded by this evidence, but it could not have taken longer than a few 100 million years. Now, if there's a process which happens in a period of time short compared to the time available, we are tempted to say it is a likely process. The origin of life happened on a time scale much shorter than the age of the Earth. And that at least suggests that the origin of life is in some sense easy. It's not hard. It happened fast. Something must encourage it, must make it easy. And we have to now ask, what is that something? How does life come into being? Now, if we could understand the origin of life, the origin of a system able to make identical copies of itself, and if there are changes in its hereditary instructions, those changes also are accurately repeated, then we can understand, at least in principle, the entire future history of life. Because we understand from the epical work of Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace in the United Kingdom, except it wasn't called the United Kingdom then, I don't believe, how evolution comes about. Mr. Darwin's portrait is sitting here. I don't know if that's exactly a scowl, but I like to think of him as delighted at having come upon such a splendid idea, but he doesn't look extremely happy in this particular picture. Perhaps it was indigestion after breakfast. But the basic idea of evolution is that there are occasional changes, variants, different kinds of organisms which spontaneously arise. Most of those make the organism less suited to the environment, more poorly adapted, and that organism loses out in competition with other organisms. But occasionally, by accident, an organism comes into being which is better able to deal with the environment it's in, that particular millennium, or era, or epoch, and it does better, leaves more offspring, and that variety tends to predominate. There is nothing in this process which is, so far as we know, preordained. It is a process which is extremely wasteful because many natural experiments happen which result in organisms which are less suited to the environment. Only a tiny fraction are better suited and are the aperture, the road to the future. The secret of evolution is an enormous period of time and the deaths of many maladapted, poorly adapted organisms. Now, to understand the entire magnificent panorama of life, the remarkable history over the last few billions of years, we must understand what life is, and in particular, how the first system capable of making copies of itself could come into being. To do that, we have to understand how life today does it. Now, we've just been looking at an astonishing diversity of life. But that diversity is, in a way, misleading. You, for example, look different from an oak tree. I'm sure everybody would agree with that. But down deep, where it really counts, you are not very different from an oak tree. You are astonishingly like an oak tree. The oak tree is astonishingly like you. Suppose we look closely at one of the cells in your body, and you have something like 10 trillion cells, so you could easily lose one without minding. We find that it does an enormous amount of chemistry, and that chemistry is controlled by molecules called enzymes. All the enzymes are proteins. It's a kind of molecule. And these proteins control what chemical reactions occur in your body at what time and are really in charge of what the cell does. Now, the instructions for the proteins to tell them when to be made and when to operate are controlled by a different molecule, the other major molecule in your cells, and those molecules are called nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are molecules able to reproduce themselves, molecules able to instruct the cell as to what proteins should be made. The proteins are the active elements that make the cell do its stuff. If we could understand something of the proteins and nucleic acid origins, we certainly would have understood something important about the origin of life. Now, about you and the oak tree. If we look at an oak tree's cell, we find, again, the same kinds of proteins, the same kinds of nucleic acids, and astonishingly enough, the same code book, which translates nucleic acid information into protein information. The oak tree could read your genetic code, which contains all the information there is about how to make a human being. Your cells could read the oak tree's genetic code. The oak tree is not motivated to make human beings are not motivated to make oak trees, but you could do it. And this is true, so far as we know, of every organism on the earth. They all use proteins to make the chemistry go, all use nucleic acids to control the proteins and to reproduce and to pass hereditary information on from generation to generation. There are no departures from this. All the organisms down deep are the same. This deep relationship suggests that we are all cousins. Us oak trees, us beagles, us begonias, us baleen whales, we're all related closely. And that's one reason why it's so interesting to look for life elsewhere, to see if life on other planets is built on the same chemical principles as on the Earth, or might be in some way very, very different. Now, I want to spend just a minute describing in a little more detail the proteins and the nucleic acids. To do that, we have to talk a little bit about chemistry. Before me on this table are models of lots of chemicals. They look pretty complicated. That's because the chemistry of life is pretty complicated. We should not be intimidated by the complexity. In fact, I will start with a very simple molecule. Okay? It's a sort of barbell, not difficult to lift. Real atoms are about 100 millionth of a centimeter across. So if I held one up, you would have difficulty seeing it, even with the zoom lens on the television cameras. So we make molecular models, which make things about 100 million times larger, and then we can get some sense of them. Each white sphere is a hydrogen atom. The two together make a hydrogen molecule. Each red sphere is an oxygen atom. The two together make an oxygen molecule. Each blue sphere is a nitrogen atom. The two together make a nitrogen molecule. Here is a molecule made, you can see it looks a little bit like Mickey Mouse, of one oxygen atom, that's the red, and two hydrogen atoms, that's the white. That's H2O, otherwise known as water. Now, let's find one other nice one. Here is one carbon atom, that's the black fellow, and two red atoms, those are oxygens, and the three together make CO2, carbon dioxide. Now, the Earth's atmosphere is made mostly of nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water. So if we were to grab a handful of air and look closely at it, we would find that it was made almost entirely of these particular molecules. There are other kinds of molecules, and I will come to them in a minute. But it's interesting that most organic molecules, the ones that life is made of, the ones that contribute to proteins, nucleic acids, are made mostly of these four atoms: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. Now, proteins are built out of building blocks called amino acids. Here is an amino acid with a nice little ticket on it. It's aspartic acid. They have very nice names. And these amino acids link up into long chains called proteins. And I think it would be nice if we were to do such a link. And I will need volunteers from the audience who want to be molecules. Please, all of you who wish to be molecules, please come down. And let's line up right here. Have maybe 10 molecules. Okay, now why don't you all face this way, and let's make a kind of line. And I'd like everybody, okay, that's, I think, enough. That's good. Make a nice molecule. I'd like everybody to do two things. First of all, come over here, stand facing this way. And I hope you all can read. And when I give you the molecule, say what it is.
Aspartic acid.
Aspartic acid. Very good. And then, would you please say what it is? Go ahead, give it a try. Leucine. Now, I would like to have a link between two amino acids like that. Good. The next one, can you read this one?
Glycine.
Very good. Would you please hook up to leucine right here? Here is an alanine. Would you hook up to glycine? Very good. Here is glutamic acid. Terrific. Histidine, you're a reasonably complex amino acid. Cysteine, you are a sulfur-containing amino acid. Not many of them. And asparagine comes from asparagus. Good, and we'll do one more. Forgive me those amino acids in the back. Here is glutamine. Now, would you hook up? And may I have one more amino acid for me? I'll be valine. And now we have a short chain of amino acids, which is a kind of small protein. Now, this protein controls some chemistry in the cell. Not all the amino acids work. It might be only these 4 amino acids right here which do the work, and the rest of us sort of along for the ride. And now we will have a little protein dance. Okay? Okay, now back the other way. Good. Thank you very much. Good. Now, would each person please put his amino acid back? Thank you. I apologize to those amino acids who did not get to dance. Now, that's not exactly how the amino acids link up, but it gives you a kind of idea. Many proteins are so long that if every person in this room were an amino acid, it would we still could not make the protein of the appropriate length. Many more amino acids than the number of people in this room. So that's about the proteins. Now, let me say just a word about the nucleic acids. They're made out of different sort of bits. A bit that looks like this, a bit that looks like this, and these bits are arranged in pairs. And I have the pairs the wrong way around. As rungs in a ladder. An enormous number of rungs in the ladder. And what happens is the latter is able to unzip, and each half makes a copy of the other half. And that is how the nucleic acids reproduce themselves, and that is how we reproduce ourselves on the essential molecular level. The nucleic acid molecule itself, here is a very short piece of it, looks like this. And here, the various atoms have been compressed closer than in these models, so we don't have the little connections as we had in the previous model. And this is only about 2.5 loops or winds of this helical molecule. Imagine it going about 500 feet in the air, and you'll have a sense of what nucleic acid molecules are really about. Now, if I can surrender my nucleic acid extremely short molecule here, let us return to the question of the origin of life. How do we make such molecules? Well, noting that air is made of essentially the same atoms as most amino acids, maybe we would have the following idea. Let's take the molecules of air, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water, put them together in a kind of flask, send some energy through the flask that'll tear atoms apart, and if we're very lucky, maybe the atoms will recombine in a way to make some nice amino acid. That would be very lucky. So let's do that. Here behind me is an experiment in which that is being done. This is an experiment first done by Stanley Miller in the early 1950s. Here we have a primitive ocean, extremely small ocean. It's boiling, water is rising, condenses in this flask, which contains the other molecules of air, and then circulates back through the ocean. Now we have to supply some energy. Maybe it would be ultraviolet light from the sun, maybe it would be an electrical spark. Let's do an electrical spark. Maestro. There. So now before your eyes, atoms of air are being torn apart, and the pieces are reassembling themselves. And if we let this go on for, about a few hours, we would have used up a lot of the air. What would we have made? Would we have made molecules useful for life? We would not have. We would, in fact, have made smog. We would have gone backwards from life instead of forwards. Well, let's reconsider the experiment. We started with air. Air contains oxygen. Oxygen is made by green plants. Could there be green plants before the origin of life? Unlikely, right? Because plants are alive. So we've made a silly mistake. We put in a product of life before there could have been life. Let us throw the oxygen away, do the experiment again with water, nitrogen, carbon dioxide. We will do that in the second experiment. Here, if we let this go for a few hours, we do make some molecules. We make formic acid, and we make formaldehyde. Now, because formaldehyde is used for preserving dead animals, you might think it's not too useful for life either. But that's not the case. Can I just get by, Bill? Yes. Thank you. Because if you have a lot of formaldehyde molecules and you let them sit together, they will spontaneously combine to form sugars. And you can see that it's a repetition of this same formaldehyde unit which makes sugar molecules. And sugars are very definitely part of what we're interested in. Sugars are part of the building blocks of the nucleic acids. So we've done something right. We just haven't done it enough. Now, to do it enough, we have to ask, what is it we just did between the first and second experiment? What we did is to have more hydrogen and less oxygen. If we look at typical organic molecules, we see lots of these little white spheres. Organic molecules have lots of hydrogen. Maybe we should do this experiment with lots of hydrogen. But is that justified? Is there any reason to think that the early Earth had more hydrogen than today? Well, the early Earth formed out of typical cosmic matter, and we have to ask, what is the universe made out of? Does it have a lot of hydrogen or only a very little? Now, the way that scientists usually examine the stars, gas between the stars, planets, to see what they're made out of, is by spectroscopy. And here, what happens is light passes through a kind of slit, then through a prism, which breaks initially white light up into a kind of rainbow pattern. And here, if we can have the lights down, we can see just such a thing happening in the apparatus that Mr. Coates is handling. This lovely rainbow is initially white light spread out into its constituent colors by a prism, an experiment first done by Isaac Newton. Now, if we take a particular kind of atom and send its light that it likes to shine through such a device called a spectrometer, we will get not a full rainbow, but a particular set of colors. So here we have the mercury atom, which is being induced by Mr. Coates to give off light. And that light comes in only 3 spectral lines that are strong here, a yellow one, a green one, and a purple one. If you saw such a spectrum coming from some object, you would say, my goodness, that object is made out of mercury. Now, in this way, we can look anywhere in the universe that's giving off light and have some idea of what its chemistry might be. So if we do that, we find a remarkable result. We find that almost anywhere we look, we see that the universe is red. This turns out to be a chemical, not a political remark. This is the Horsehead Nebula. You can see why it's called that. The dark cloud there looks like a horse's head. But the red gas that surrounds it is absolutely typical of what happens when you take long-time exposure photographs of virtually any place in the universe. And the next slide is another example. This is the Rosette Nebula, and it also is mostly glowing red. Hydrogen likes to give off a spectral line in the red, and that red line is seen almost everywhere. The sun is mostly made of hydrogen. The stars, the galaxies, the space between the stars, the big planets like Jupiter in our solar system. In fact, almost everything is made of hydrogen except the Earth. The Earth is almost the only funny thing around in terms of chemistry. Why? So, first of all, our assumption that the early Earth should have been rich in hydrogen is a perfectly good one. And before I return to the origin of life experiment, let me just ask this question. Why should the Earth, if it once had hydrogen, not have it today? And the answer is that hydrogen, the simplest, easiest molecule, used to be here, there it is, can run away into space. It is so light that if it's sitting around in the upper atmosphere of the Earth, it can be collided with by some other big, heavy, stolid molecule and made to move very fast. And if there are no other molecules in the way, and if it's moving at escape velocity, it will run away into space. The Earth's atmosphere, the upper atmosphere, is very hot, and it has very little gravity, and so this is symbolic only. Hydrogen will run away from the Earth. On the other hand, Jupiter has such a low temperature in its upper atmosphere and such a high gravity that not a single hydrogen molecule could have escaped from it in the entire history of the solar system. Now let us return to our experiments. Suppose we now mix together not oxygen, but water, the kind of oxygen which has the most hydrogens on it. Not nitrogen, but ammonia, 1 nitrogen atom and 3 hydrogen atoms, the kind of nitrogen which has the most hydrogen attached to it. Not carbon dioxide, but methane, 1 carbon atom and 4 hydrogen atoms. If we mix those gases together, as in the third experiment here, supply some energy and let it go for a while, we produce the most astonishing stuff and have made a major step towards the origin of life. We're showing here an experiment done with a lightning or electrical discharge as the energy source, but in other experiments, for example, in this one in our laboratory at Cornell University, there is an ultraviolet light source. You can see the transparent flask at the beginning of the experiment, but at the end of the experiment, we have a flask filled with brownish, powdery stuff. What is this brownish, powdery stuff? It is essentially all of the molecules on the table in front of me. We have made a great variety of organic molecules. The necktie that you saw there was for color comparison purposes only. We cannot do an experiment in which we start out with the gases and waters of the primitive Earth, and at the end of the experiment, somebody crawls out of the test tube. We haven't done that yet. But what we can do is make all of the amino acids, all of the building blocks of the nucleic acids, and even hook them up to make short proteins and short nucleic acids. Now, the rabbit that we talked about early in the lecture, no one can make. There isn't enough time to start such an experiment and wind up with, let's say, a rabbit. As you might imagine, I need a volunteer for this part of the experiment, please. Now, it would be lovely if we could make any organism, but remember how complex the organism was and how simple these molecules are. There simply isn't enough time. But maybe such a thing might someday be possible. Could you please examine this hat and show that it's empty? Oh, it's not empty. There is in it a molecule of cysteine. See, it's yellow. It's a sulfur-containing amino acid. Could you now please see if the hat is empty?
Yes.
It's empty. I'm not good at this. See, it's empty, and I'm supposed to show you that it does that, and now I have to open it up again. There was a way I forgot. There, it opens up. Now, put the empty hat down. Could you please check that there's, the table is okay? There's nothing around there. Oh, well, okay. Yes, that's certainly empty enough. Could you now check that the hat is still empty? Good, thank you. And now, could we please pull off? And here, thank you. In fact, I'll give you this rabbit in just a minute to hold. If you sit down for a minute, I'll bring him over to you. This is what we can't make. But we've only just started. These kinds of experiments have only been underway for something like 30 years. Once we have a few 100 million years to do such experiments as nature has, perhaps we will be able to get as far as a microbe, if not a rabbit. Thank you. You get to keep them until the end of the talk. I've always wanted to wear one of these. We don't have them in America, so I'm going to wear this for a while. Now, maybe you remember looks kind of funny. Maybe you remember the kind of brownish, powdery stuff which was inside that last experimental flask. That material has a characteristic color. It's always made in these experiments. And therefore, it's very interesting that there is a place in the solar system where such coloration is present extremely vividly. And that's in the outer solar system, in the vicinity of Jupiter. Now here is an old, I think, 17th century picture of people looking up with an early telescope, and there in the sky is Jupiter. And you can see, even in this early picture, there's a little bit of brownish coloration. and you can see 3 or 4 of the 4 big or Galilean satellites of Jupiter. If we look at a more modern picture, this is a Pioneer 11 photograph of Jupiter. We see the beautiful bands and belts, the belts colored brown. You can also see the great red spot, so-called because it's orange. You can see white clouds. In fact, everything we're looking at here is clouds and atmosphere. There is no surface to be seen. If there is a surface, it's far below. What is the source of the coloration in such a picture? We can look more closely, and here's another. This is about the closest up picture of Jupiter we have. There's no question about the brown color. In fact, it's very similar in detail to the detailed spectroscopic signature to what we make in the laboratory. What is this stuff? Well, the atmosphere of Jupiter is hydrogen-rich. It has hydrogen, water, methane, and ammonia. Ultraviolet light comes in from the sun. There probably are electrical discharges, lightning, in the atmosphere. Jupiter is a place very much like this third experiment. These same organic molecules ought to be made on Jupiter, and perhaps the brownish coloration is telling us that such organic molecules are indeed there. Here is a picture shot from beneath, looking up towards the south pole of Jupiter, down at the bottom. And if we look more closely at such a region, we see astonishing bubbles, cyclones, storm systems. The great red spot, in fact, is probably a storm system which has been in existence for 1 million years, a hurricane that has lasted for 1 million years. The weather on Jupiter is astonishing, and we can learn an enormous amount about climate, weather, circulation of atmospheres by looking at Jupiter, precisely because it's a different kind of place from here. Here is an artist's conception of the clouds of Jupiter. You can see high up in the atmosphere the white clouds, which we believe are condensed ammonia, frozen ammonia crystals, just as the upper atmosphere of the Earth has frozen water crystals. And then below is the reddish or brownish stuff, which maybe is organic molecules. And you can also see that the artist has put a few lightning bolts in at lower right, just to remind us that there is some energy there. Now, the clouds of Jupiter can be calculated to be something like this. Here we have, up at the top, the solid ammonia. The next layer is a kind of mixture of ammonia and hydrogen sulfide. Below that is a cloud layer of ice, and below that is a cloud layer of aqueous ammonia, a little bit like the household ammonia solution that people use to disinfect. Now, the temperature of the household ammonia on Jupiter is about room temperature. Now, I know room temperature is different in the United States than in Britain, but the two are close enough. Jupiter has a place where there is lots of liquid water, which is at room temperature, and where organic matter is falling from the sky like manna from heaven. Now, that is a place at least interesting in terms of biology. We do not know if life has evolved on Jupiter, but it's clear that organic chemistry can proceed on Jupiter, at least for a period of time. Could there be living organisms on Jupiter? We do not know. There have been speculations about it, and here is one particularly ugly artist's conception of what life on Jupiter might be like. Here we imagine enormous creatures like whales swimming, floating through the clouds of Jupiter, gathering in the organic matter which may be there, with eyes much too big to be reasonable. And you can see they go like a ramjet, sucking in the atmosphere at the front and blowing it out the back. And if I had that hydrogen balloon, wait, I have another one. If I could only make a hole in it, maybe I can, without bursting it. The organisms on Jupiter, if any, probably do better than that. We do not know that there's life on Jupiter. I don't want you to think that it's something that is considered likely. We do not, on the other hand, know that there isn't. It is an interesting, exciting possibility which we will have the opportunity to explore in future spacecraft exploration of Jupiter. By the way, everything we've been talking about so far about Jupiter is in an extremely thin layer in the very top of the atmosphere of Jupiter. Thank you. It's this green layer right here. In fact, it's thinner than we were able to paint it. Is the atmosphere and clouds that we've been talking about. Below that, this pinkish region in this model, is liquid hydrogen. And below that is solid metallic hydrogen, a sort of hydrogen you don't bump into every day on the Earth. Hydrogen as a metal is not a commonplace on the Earth, and the reason is that the pressures here are simply not great enough to make hydrogen into a metal. Because Jupiter is so massive, it's the most massive planet in the solar system, hydrogen does get made into a metal there. Possibly in the very heart of Jupiter, there is a core of rock and metal, a planet something like the Earth, hiding in the inside of this enormous hydrogen-rich liquid and gaseous planet. Now, let us examine briefly a few more things in the Jupiter vicinity and further out. Here is simply a reminder that spacecraft are on their way to Jupiter and beyond to take close-up looks, much better than any which has been obtained so far. Here are 4 drawings made by visual observers on the Earth of what they think they may have seen on the surfaces of the 4 big moons of Jupiter. And here are 4 maps of the 4 moons. And you can see here is Io, the innermost moon, Europa, the next one, Ganymede, the 3rd one, and Callisto, the 4th one. And there are features on the surface. But what do those features mean? We haven't the foggiest idea. We know that they're icy. Here is an astonishing picture of Io taken in the spectral line given off by sodium. And it turns out that Io has left behind it a cloud of sodium gas swept away from its surface. And what some people think is that Io once had oceans in which were sodium salts and potassium salts and other such salts. The water escaped to space just as the hydrogen escapes from the Earth, leaving behind the salts which are now being blasted off by a high radiation environment which surrounds Jupiter. That is one of many indications that the moons in the outer solar system are not like our moon, are very different sorts of places. Now, beyond the Jupiter system are many other objects. Interior to the Jupiter system are many other objects also, because between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter are an enormous array of asteroids, little rocky objects, but they're not all rocky. This is an artist's conception of one, but many of these objects now turn out to be rich in organic matter, since they probably were formed in the earliest history of the solar system. That suggests that organic matter was very abundant early at the time that planets were being formed, and the 2 moons of Mars, of which we'll talk about in a later lecture, now seem to be made of organic molecules. If we move outwards from the asteroids and Jupiter, we come to this object, which may not look familiar to you. This is in fact Saturn, but seen with the rings edge on, so you can't see them. And maybe you can see a little hint of color in the region just above and beneath the shadow of the ring. If we look at Saturn at another time, we see much more color, and whatever it is that colors Jupiter is probably part of the coloration of Saturn as well. Here is a lovely picture of Saturn as seen from the surface of one of its moons. Notice the presence of some kind of ice, maybe water, but maybe ammonia, maybe methane, on the surface of the moon. And notice the shadow of Saturn on its rings, and also note the break in the rings, the so-called Cassini division, which seems to be a place where ring particles aren't. What are the rings of Saturn? Well, I'll mention it in just a moment. Here you can see the rings edge on from the surface of a moon about halfway out, and you can see 3 interior moons in this artist's drawing in the ring plane. Were we to go very close to the rings, we would see that they are a swarm of orbiting snowballs. There are millions of snowballs in orbit around Saturn. It would be a great place for a snowball fight. It would also be a very interesting place to examine close up. The rings are either a place where a moon was torn apart by the gravity of Saturn, or where a moon was prevented from being formed by the gravity of Saturn. In addition, there is an amazing moon of Saturn called Titan. It is a moon with an atmosphere. The atmosphere is made of methane and hydrogen. It is hotter than it ought to be on the surface. It seems to have a cloud layer which is brown and unbroken and possibly made of organic matter. It is an astonishing place, and it probably really looks more like this picture where we can see the brown clouds, and the artist has drawn a kind of methane volcano erupting. The outer solar system is the object of many space vehicle missions now underway. And I'd like to close by saying a few words about those space vehicle missions. 2 of them have already been launched long ago, Pioneers 10 and 11. Pioneer 10 has already passed by Jupiter and will leave the solar system. Pioneer 11 has passed by Jupiter, but in 1979 will enter the Saturn system, and if it still survives, maybe we'll get some pictures and other data in a preliminary way of what Saturn is about. Voyager, which I talked about in the last lecture, is a splendid, magnificent kind of spacecraft. You can see booms for magnetometers and atomic batteries, an enormous antenna to send information back to Earth, and over here, a set of instruments to examine very carefully Jupiter and Saturn and their 20-odd moons, the rings of Saturn, Uranus, if we're lucky, and the newly discovered rings of Uranus. This will be an astonishing set of results. It will fly by the Jupiter system in 1979, the Saturn system in 1981, and therefore in just the next few years we will see coming through 50,000 photographs, an enormous number of spectra telling us about composition and pressure and temperature. We will really learn what these places are like. And then beyond that, there is one last approved mission by NASA in which a spacecraft called Jupiter Orbiter with probe will go into orbit around Jupiter and then drop a probe into the atmosphere of Jupiter, so that for the first time we will examine close up the chemistry, pressure, and temperature of a Jovian planet. The Jovian planets, hydrogen-rich, like the primitive atmosphere of the Earth, are very different from the terrestrial Earth-like planets. It may be that we can learn about the early chemistry of life best by examining the outer solar system. Perhaps even there is life out there. What is guaranteed is that those worlds are entrancing, fascinating, and well worth a deep analysis. In only a few years, we will have made such a deep analysis.